territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for tuning in tonight and throughout this challenging yet rewarding season. As we wind up this Friday, we're getting a little reflective. Our year started with a marathon live stream of the complete Mueller report. Remember the Mueller report? And finished with a marathon of just under 90 consecutive live streams. It's not what we had in mind. Town Hall will be on hiatus for much of July, returning on Monday, July 27th, but you won't want to miss our final program on Friday, a special live recording of our new podcast, Life on the Margins, featuring Ijeoma Oluo in conversation with our hosts Marcus Harrison Green, Enrique Serna, and Ginny Palmer. The series, by the way, is co-produced with South Seattle Emerald. We'll be back sooner than you'd like, I bet, but in the meantime, please visit Town Hall's media library for hundreds of events from both the recent and pre-COVID past. But back to tonight. The program will last about 40 minutes, followed by audience Q&A. You can view the event on Crowdcast, Facebook, or YouTube. To participate in the Q&A, though, you'll want to submit directly using the Ask a Question button on the bottom of the Crowdcast pane. We'll try to get to as many as possible. For closed captioning, YouTube is your best bet. You can enable real-time captions by clicking the CC button in the bottom right corner. And I just said that. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Civics programs in particular are supported by the Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, KUOW, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But finally, as most of you know, Town Hall is a member-supported organization first and foremost. I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. On that note, Town Hall, like nearly every nonprofit you know, has been blindsided by the economic impacts of this pandemic. Most of the for-profits too, in fairness. But tonight's event is free to maximize access, but we hope you will consider a donation by clicking on the button at the bottom of Crowdcast, or by using the URLs on the other platforms, or by becoming a member. And finally, if we were gathered together tonight in the Great Hall, fully half of you would visit the book signing table. And so we hope you'll use the link on this live stream page to purchase your copy of Pramila's book directly through our terrific partners at Elliott Bay Book Company. Here's a further incentive. Pramila will be signing a big stack of them on or around July 12th. So if you buy tonight, you'll be sure to get your own copy with her autograph. And if that's not incentive enough, if you keep your purchase local, just maybe some of the things that we loved about this place pre-epidemic might make it to the other side. All right then. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal was elected in 2016 to the House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives, I should say, and is now serving her second term representing Washington's 7th District, which encompasses most of Seattle. She's been a leader on immigration, income inequality, healthcare, higher education, women's rights, and climate justice, and was the lead sponsor of the Medicare For All bill. Prior to serving in elected office, Congresswoman Jayapal spent 20 years working internationally and domestically in global public health and development as an advocate for women's, immigrant, civil, and human rights, including 12 years as the founder and executive director of One America, formerly Hate Free Zone, the largest immigrant advocacy organization in Washington state and one of the largest in the country. Naomi Ishisaka is a columnist for the Seattle Times with a focus on racial equity and social justice. She's also a photographer, and her writing and photography have appeared in the Times and Seattle Magazine. Meanwhile, her documentary photography of Seattle's Black Lives Matter movement has been featured in a number of shows and galleries, as well as in Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th. Jayapal's book, Use the Power You Have, A Brown Woman's Guide to Politics and Political Change, is the subject of tonight's talk. Tonight is officially the launch of this book, and it's her first event, so make some noise loud enough that she can hear you all the way through the internet. Please join me in welcoming Naomi Ishisaka and Representative Pramila Jayapal.
Thank you so much. So thank you for that introduction. It's really, really great to be here with Pramila and my friend, who I've known since 2001, since the days after 9/11. So that's coming up on almost 20 years, which is kind of hard to believe since we're both in our 20s. But reading the book was really a walk down memory lane for me, just looking back at that time and everything that happened and how we thought that was kind of the darkest days of our country, I think. And you know, so it was really great to revisit some of that history, and it was really great that you were able to actually, you know, remember all of that history, which was wonderful. But first, I wanted to kind of start with an excerpt. So I know you want to read an excerpt from the book.
Yeah.
So maybe start with that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I want to start by saying hello to all my friends. I was watching a little bit of the chat. Now they've taken it away, so I can't see it. But I know that there are just so many people who are so important to this community and to me on this call. And I wanted to start by thanking Town Hall Seattle for, you know, all of the work that you have done. And you are actually in the book because we talk about that first Justice for All hearing that we did at Seattle Town Hall just a year after 9/11. And I'm just so grateful to Town Hall for this space, even though I know we're working with the new circumstances that we have. I want to thank Elliott Bay Books. My first book came out back in 2000, and the reading was at Elliott Bay, and I talk about this in the book as well. I was terrified to speak in front of anybody. I got butterflies, and I had to go upstairs in Elliott Bay because I just wasn't sure I could do that. And so our independent booksellers are so important, and I'm just really very, very grateful to Elliott Bay for always being there on so many levels. Naomi, I want to thank you. This is so exciting for me to be able to do this conversation with you and to have this chance to both go down memory lane, but also look into the future, which I try to do a little bit of both in the book. And then the book is dedicated to my parents who are in India. I have not gotten to live on the same continent as them since I was 16 years old. And it was the ultimate sacrifice that they made to send me here. And I believe that the one wonderful thing about having to do this live stream is that I believe that my mother is listening in. And so, Mom, if you're listening in, I just want to tell you, this is the book. You haven't even gotten to see it yet. And it's dedicated to you and to Papa. And I want to say thank you for everything that you have done. I know I have a lot of other family on the phone as well. My sister from Portland, my beautiful kid in Oakland, my husband, and all of my friends. And there are many people that are in this book in different ways. So when you read it, I hope you see yourself in here, and I hope you accept my thanks for the part that you played in so much of this story. So I'm reading from a chapter that's called Why Not Me? Running for Office. And it's really why I decided to run for office. And I'll just read a little excerpt from here. I never thought I would run for office. For 20 years, I had been an activist pushing for change from the outside. I had used every tool I could think of in my toolbox to advocate for positive changes on issues from immigration to environmental justice to economic inequality. I had led voter registration drives, rallies, marches, even nonviolent civil disobedience actions where I was arrested twice. I deeply believed that organizing, advocacy, and storytelling by real people were what made change happen. Truth be told, I was quite cynical about elected officials. Over the course of my 2 decades of organizing, I saw too few who were willing to use their positions to exercise leadership, particularly when an issue was seen as controversial. The things I had seen, government incursions into civil liberties post 9/11, Islamophobia, and anti-immigrant sentiment, among others, regularly required people who were willing to speak out before an issue was popular. And yet, too many elected officials were inclined to wait before speaking out. They followed rather than led. Even in my state, where we did have some champions and some successes, it took enormous amounts of pushing and in some cases years to get the attention of elected officials. I was also deeply frustrated at the lack of diversity and representation I saw among those who held elected office. Low-income people, people of color, immigrants, women, and other marginalized communities were simply not represented. I had to explain for too long, too hard, and too loudly about what seemed like obvious problems to me. Many in government had been there for a long time and did not seem to understand what life was actually like for the huge number of their constituents who had very different backgrounds and experiences from them. Even in the Democratic Party, few elected officials were willing to talk about race or class or take on stereotypes that were baked into the policies that even Democrats proposed. Perhaps the struggle around race and moneyed interests should not have been surprising to me or any other student of history. Just look at slavery and the Dixiecrats, President Lyndon Johnson's war on crime, which increased the incarceration of Black and brown people, and President Bill Clinton's promise to, quote, end welfare as we know it, which led to cutting aid to poor people, as well as his draconian 1996 immigration bill, which criminalized immigrants and expanded detention and deportation without due process. As an activist, I had even taken on President Barack Obama for being the deporter-in-chief, a still unpopular, but in my view, necessary critique of an otherwise extremely popular president. I had taken mental note of a long list of times when Democrats said talking about race was divisive, or that we shouldn't focus on institutionalized racism because it would push away white voters, or that certain policies to rectify the wrongs we saw would be counter to our interests in some false analysis of national security or safety. When I first began organizing after September 11th around the detention and deportation of Muslims and Arabs, there were very few elected officials willing to stand with me. So-called national security concerns triumphed over civil rights and civil liberties because, once again, communities of color were treated as the suspicious other. My congressman, Jim McDermott, was an exception, as was our only Black county council member, Larry Gossett. When I began organizing rallies outside mosques to protest the lack of due process for Muslim Americans and for Arab Americans who were being secretly detained and deported in the middle of the night, it became even more difficult to find elected leaders who would stand with us. Our message fell on more sympathetic ears with locally elected officials, like Councilmember Nick Licata, with whom we worked to pass one of the first sanctuary city ordinances in the country to prevent local police and city officials from asking about immigration status. The higher the elected official rose, the harder it seemed to be to get them to take a stand that might be seen as controversial. Back then, immigration reform was far from popular, and it took years to convince our own congressional delegation to boldly embrace humane and just immigration reform. My first light bulb moment about how to build greater political power for immigrants came in 2004. I realized that elected officials seemed to care only about two things. First, money from donors and corporate lobbyists, which seemed to work to block courageous votes or action. And second, sometimes in this order, the votes of their own constituents. We didn't have any money, but couldn't we organize existing voters, maybe even register new voters? Could we mobilize those voters to build the political power of immigrants and demand that politicians respond to our community's needs? The truth was, too many immigrants had lost faith in government, and they didn't vote. Like me, they didn't see elected officials who represented them, or looked like them, or understood their lives. Some even just sat out the elections because they felt cynical about the people who were running and their desire to really serve and make a difference. Many had also not received the kind of civic education that even allowed them to understand the basic processes of voting in the United States, which are far from simple for a new American in this country. Could we get them to care about and trust the power of the vote? I decided to try an experiment. Hate Free Zone partnered with the brand new Seattle chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, to implement a new pilot project designed to get Muslim Americans educated about and registered to vote, and then actually turn them out to vote. It was a small project implemented just months before the 2004 election. We went into mosques and community centers and registered some 300 new Muslim American voters. They were well aware of the terrible things that were happening to their communities in the years after 9/11, but our job was to convince them that their voices and their votes would make a difference. This required a lot of conversation, education, and ultimately mobilization to get them to the polls when it was time to vote. In the end, 98% of them voted. Armed with a successful pilot project, we began a much larger voter registration drive in 2005 and 2006, ultimately registering over 27,000 new American citizens to vote. It was the largest voter registration drive in the history of Washington State, and it caught the attention of our elected officials. At approximately the same time, we began a statewide campaign to push Washington's Governor Christine Gregoire to establish a New Americans Policy Council and to fund a massive program to help legal permanent residents who were eligible to get their citizenship. In 2008, we were able to establish the first ever state-level policy council and get funding for that new American citizenship program, which is still thriving. If I had ever questioned what it really meant to build political power, I could see it starting to work now. And yet, in spite of all of our work on immigration, we fought frustrating battles to get elected officials to come out and support certain parts of our work, particularly against unjust and cruel enforcement measures against immigrants. I've come to believe that the term progressive really just refers to the people who advocate for justice on an issue first before it is popular. All of this contributed to my own distrust of elected officials and kept me away from the idea of running for office myself. Community members would often mention the possibility to me, but it's notable that nobody from the Democratic Party machine asked me to run. I was not part of the system. I was pushing people hard for what I believed is necessary, and I was not wealthy or well-connected, all viewed as negatives to the party machine that had a lot to say about who would run for office, or at least who would get early needed support. As activists, we were critical of the way government worked, and yet at the same time, we turned up our noses at the idea of running for office ourselves. I realized that in our own judgmental way, we were ceding important political space to others instead of occupying it ourselves. What if we began to think about running for office as a way to organize more people, to connect people to government, to bring organizing from the outside to the inside, to have the proverbial seat at the table, but to use it to lead, not just to follow? It was the beginning of the formation of my new theory of change. For years, I had believed that if politics is the art of the possible, then it is our job as activists to push the boundaries of what is seen as possible, but from the outside. Why couldn't that pushing also occur from the platform of elected office? And elected office could be the biggest organizing platform yet. Perhaps part of the problem was that there just weren't enough of us on the inside to do the pushing. And I realized you really need people working from both the inside and the outside for change to happen as quickly as necessary. We don't get a more responsive government unless we systematically run organizing campaigns to change the way government works. We don't understand what we are really dealing with or how to change it unless we know exactly how it works now. We don't get a more powerful and progressive group of elected officials unless we insert ourselves into the equation. And we can't organize on the inside if we have no organizers on the inside. In other words, we don't get a more representative government unless we run it ourselves. I decided it was time to run for the Washington State Senate. So that's a little piece of just why I started to think about this crazy idea of running for office. And I'm looking forward to the conversation with you, Naomi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just a note for the audience, we have the ability to take questions. We're going to be talking for about 40 minutes or so, and then we want to leave the rest of the time for questions. And if you have a question, you can just press the Ask a Question button and fill out the question. And for other people who just want to vote up questions, you can do that as well. And we'll take a look at that as we sort through them at the end. So please add your questions there, and we'll take a look at them in the question and answer period. So one of the things that you talked about in the book was the events that were turning points in history. Can you talk about what some of those events have been for you?
You mean in terms of the events that define sort of my organizing platform,
yeah,
or just more broad? Well, I think 9/11 was really. I think 9/11 was really formative. You know, I had done nonprofit work before that, but it was international development work. It was not taking on my own government. It was, in many ways, it was service work. It was important social justice work. but it was not necessarily organizing. Now, I learned a lot about organizing from many of the women in particular in other countries that I met and that I saw doing their work, but I personally was not an organizer. And I don't think I ever really thought that I would be somebody who would take on the Bush administration. But 9/11 happened, and it was so startling, so shocking, as you said. You know, so much of 9/11 felt like this was the worst we were ever going to see. I didn't think that it could get worse, and here we are in 2020. But I think that was extremely formative for me. And there were a number of events along the way after that, if I were to map out a timeline, they included things like the passing of the Patriot Act, special registration, a number of things that I call now post 9/11. But they were actually the foundations of a lot of what we see the Trump administration doing today. This is not the first Muslim ban. And so I think that was very important for me in the moment, but then also in the things that followed on after that. There were other moments of, immigration reform, times when I was arrested, both in the Capitol and in Seattle, that were formative because the time in Seattle that I was arrested was the first time. And we did a lot of training and preparation for it. It wasn't just let's go out into the street. We actually built community. We learned about the civil disobedience protests, which, by the way, we did during the 2003 Immigrant Workers' Freedom Ride as well. I touch on that briefly. But those opportunities to really learn from history and understand that those civil rights movements were steeped in deep organizing, deep leadership development, deep strategic planning and thinking. Those were important moments for me as well. And then of course, going into Trump's election, 2016, I still can't believe that it was, just about 4 years ago. And I talk about in the book how I actually thought he was going to win. Most of the people around me did not think he was going to win. I thought he was going to win, but then I allowed myself to get taught. And the reason I thought he was going to win, Naomi, is because you and I both know how race is so effective as a divisive tool. And I saw him doing all of the things that I felt were going to, unfortunately, be effective. And, but then I got myself talked into that he wasn't going to win, and I was going to be trying to pull Hillary Clinton to the left, and which sounds like a really wonderful thing at this point. But that's not what happened. And so then the time after Trump and getting elected to now, I think, is too hard to even think about every single moment. But the Muslim ban certainly was a critical moment in this fight. I'm sure I've missed a few along the way, but
One of the things you said in the book about the Trump administration was that you were worried that people were going to become numb. How do you feel that sort of played out in 4 years later?
I think that's one of the real challenges. I think it is exhausting to take on everything that he says. And in fact, now when people ask me, I try not to talk about that much of what he says, other than to say it's disgusting, it's cruel, it's xenophobic, it's racist. I'll use one or two words to describe him, but nothing that he does anymore surprises me. And that is a sort of numbness in and of itself. And at the same time, I was on Joy Reid's show the other day talking about family separation. And I said, it's really important that we do not get numb, that we call out these things, because there is something that happens in our brains if we allow ourselves to accept that that's normal. And we cannot allow it to be normal. And we cannot allow ourselves to think or to get used to it in any way, even if it's to protect ourselves. Because I think a lot of times that numbness comes from wanting to protect ourselves, feeling like we can't keep taking that in, and we can't keep taking in that negative energy, and we don't want to be associated with it. But the reality is somebody's got to take that on. It doesn't mean you have to take it on 100% of the time, but you have to take a break and then come back, take a break and then come back is what I tell people, because we just cannot afford for people to allow this to be okay or to be normal.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me in reading the book was and this is something that I believe in as well, is really centering the folks that are most impacted on an issue, both as stakeholders and sitting at the table where decisions are getting made, as well as bearing witness as a Congress member on the ground to things that are happening. Can you talk about why that's important to you and why that's like a core value?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's part of what I believe makes change, is people actually telling their stories and developing their own power. That's the whole purpose of the book, is use the power you have. We have a lot of power. And I think sometimes there are all these circumstances that contribute to people thinking they don't have power and that they can't make a difference. And I just look at myself. I mean, I don't know that I thought I didn't have power, but I certainly never imagined that I would start and run what is the largest immigrant advocacy organization in the state, or that we would be able to build the movement that would make change happen. And so the stories of people who are directly impacted bring a level of wisdom that you cannot replicate any other way. You cannot get the wisdom of direct experience from those most impacted just by reading a book. You can read a lot of analysis, you can get data, but the actual experience of what it feels like, and therefore the wisdom that comes to develop the policy that is really going to make the biggest difference, has to come from people who are most directly impacted. And I think that that is a central part of organizing. It is about people's stories and people's power, and people being the drivers of change themselves, not allowing somebody else to dictate it, but actually driving the solutions themselves. And so we tried to keep that at the center during organizing through our years at Hate Free Zone One America. As you very well know, we tried to elevate the stories of people, because I think they are the most compelling and the most powerful at making a direct connection with somebody and inspiring somebody to feel like, oh my God, I have to do something about this. And then as a legislator, it has been very important to me to develop my bills in conjunction with people who are directly affected. And so whether it was the Dignity for Detained Immigrants bill or my National Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, whatever the bill was, or Medicare for All, every single one of those was developed over the course of many, many, many months with many, many, many people at the table, sort of vetting and really thinking about what is the right solution here. And so I really believe that that's what brings the best policy solutions. And of course, it is important for all the representation reasons, because if we're saying that we're not paying attention to those voices, then we have to pay attention to those voices, and we have to bring them to the table as we develop the path forward.
And do you find that to be a common approach or an unusual approach, or?
It's pretty unusual.
Between?
You know, it's unusual in part because it's not easy. It takes a long time. You know, you're always worried about leaving out people because you want to be as inclusive as possible, but not everybody has the exact skills. And so I think about it in legislating, I think about it as different concentric circles. So we have the concentric circle of the people who are directly impacted, but also have some interest in policy and kind of how you construct policy. You've got the people who are the organizers. They're going to tell you if you've got the right solution or not, but they don't want to be in the weeds with you and figuring it out. So that's the next concentric circle. You've got the people who have, you know, the broader connections beyond that. And so I try to think about different roles that people play, because having somebody at the table doesn't mean you have to have them at the table for every step of the way, but you need to have them at the table for the part of the solution that they are most, you know, interested in being a part of. And so I think it's just hard because things move quickly. It's hard to always do that well. You can always be criticized for leaving somebody out. And so I think I've learned a lot about how to just make sure to be human in these moments and say, oh, wow, I didn't know I should have had that person at the table. You know, let's invite them in. Let's find a place for them. And I think a lot of trust is necessary for people to really engage in a way that's real, where particularly when you're crafting legislation, where you can say that doesn't have a shot of getting anywhere. Let's decide if we want it to get somewhere or if the purpose of this is as an organizing tool. So those kinds of honest conversations you really need to have trust for. And it's been a great privilege of my life that I have these amazing trusting relationships that have allowed us to develop some really phenomenal policy with the most directly impacted people at the center.
Mm-hmm. And what about that bearing witness piece? I was really moved by the story you told about the border and the experience you had at the border.
Yeah, I have always felt that I need to see things for myself. I need to be involved in them for myself. And that was true with family separation when I was the first member of Congress to go to the federal prison. It was true when I went to Tijuana, and part of it is I really believe that we are our best when we allow ourselves to feel. And it's hard. It's hard. You don't want to feel all the time. But if you can allow that to happen, I really do believe you connect to a different level of urgency and a different level of wisdom. And so I have always wanted to be in the middle of whatever it is so that I can talk directly to somebody who's being impacted. And that story never leaves my mind. And when I hear it directly from somebody, and I am sitting next to a woman who, has escaped from El Salvador and has her little baby in her arms and has been raped along the way and fought off all these terrible things, and tells me about that experience, I will never forget that experience. And I will be able to bring her story more powerfully to anybody else who doesn't have that opportunity to listen to her directly. When I'm in Tijuana, meeting with, going to the children's shelter and meeting with the young boy who had been shot in both knees and, pulled out his phone with a message from his mother, just telling him to please run to safety because he was going to be killed by the gangs. And to just that she loved him and that he had saved that message because it was all he had in this new country or he wasn't even in the new country. He was trying to get into the new country. And just watching him break down in that moment, there's an intimacy that is so powerful that it never leaves you and it forces you to take action. That's how I think about it. Mm-hmm. But it's also a deep honor and a privilege to hear those stories and then to have the responsibility of telling them to other people and trying to make change. And, that entire I talk about the family separation in the book. The entire rallies that were put on came out of those 230 women and men who were in the federal prison because I promised them that we would tell their stories and we would fight for them. And we were able to organize those rallies just in a matter of weeks. In Tijuana, being able to accompany asylum seekers across the border, having to ditch my security from the U.S. Embassy and, run to a different crossing point so that I could actually bring asylum seekers across the border and hiding my congressional pin so that the border officials wouldn't know that I was a member of Congress until I could see how they were treating them, because it was a fact-finding mission as well. They kept telling us that they were allowing people in and they weren't, and we knew they weren't. So I had to go undercover to find that. But really, it was the strength of those kids that I was accompanying and their moms across the border that made me committed to not give up, not to leave them until I got them across the border.
Yeah, I kept thinking when I read that about all the other people who were still in line, and how hard it must have been to leave the rest of the people that weren't part of that group of five.
It was so hard. And in the book, in the story, when I tell it, I say it shouldn't take a member of Congress to go and get these people to be able to apply. That was the whole point of this is, it should not take a member of Congress to go undercover and refuse to leave and, be willing to sleep on the cement floor out there, and to get people to be able to apply for what is their right. What is their right by international conventions, human rights conventions? So you're absolutely right, and I think that is one of the hardest things for everyone that we help. We have something called a private bill in Congress where you have to go through a lot of machinations and there are a lot of requirements, but you can sponsor these private bills that can delay the deportation. They're extremely difficult to get through. But every time we do one, it's a very mixed feeling because it has to be bipartisan. There are all these things. And so that one that you do, there are thousands more that don't get the private bill. And they should. It's not about deserving. It's that the system is broken and it does not meet the rights, the dignity, or the needs of people.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask a few more questions that are kind of about the book and your life, and then also just kind of shift gears into this kind of movement moment that we're in and this pandemic moment that we're in, which seems like it'll lead in well to some of the questions that were being asked here. One of the things I appreciated about the book as well was kind of gave an inside look into kind of the behind the scenes of starting out as a Congress member, that I think a lot of people, especially folks who haven't had as much access to that world have ever seen, and I was really appreciative too of the challenges that you talked about and just how open you were about the learning curve getting ramped up and things like that. And what were the most challenging parts of being a new Congress member when you first started, especially as a woman of color and in a body that I think you said only had 76 women of color in its entire history of 11,000, I think you said?
Yeah, exactly. 76 women of color have ever served out of the 11,000 that have served in Congress. I think everything I felt was just exacerbated just because Trump had been elected. And so everything was in turmoil. In some strange way, it may have offered me more opportunity to lead from the beginning than might have happened otherwise. So for example, I took an immediate leadership role on the Muslim ban. I mean, I knew this stuff. It was so strange when I went to the airport when the Muslim ban was announced. It was so familiar, except now I had the title of member of Congress. And so I could say, well, if you don't let me in, I'm just going to go in. And they looked at me and they said, well, you're going to set off all the alarms at the airport. And I said, well, I would hate to do that, but I need to head of border patrol and talk to them about this ban. So I'm going to go in. And it was the power of both the organizing knowledge that I brought from my previous life, and then this new position, which in many ways was exactly the theory of change I was talking about. Could you use that position in a different way? It was the same thing that happened with family separation. Instead of being on the outside with a rally, being able to call up the prison and say, I'm coming in. I'm a member of Congress and I'm coming in. And so I think that there were some things that were a little bit topsy-turvy as I went into Congress, but the institutions are really strong. If you're a new member of Congress, you don't get on a money committee. There's so much hierarchy there, and seniority plays a role into everything. And the infrastructure, what I noticed when I went in was the infrastructure to support progressives was not there. I felt this way in the state Senate as well when I ran, and I've talked to my friend and State Senator Joe Wynn, who may be in the audience tonight, about some of the challenges of being in these institutional bodies as a person of color, and how the structures are really set up to think in a certain way, to legislate in a certain way, and to not have the hard conversations. Nobody wants to have the hard conversations. And in Congress, it's even harder because you're talking about hundreds of people in the Democratic caucus. So imagine a caucus room, you go in and, this was pre-COVID days, of course, but if you wanted to say something, you had a minute at the mic and you had to figure out in front of all these people that you didn't know how to get your point across. And so there were, I think that there were those kinds of things. And then there are just the actual details of how a bill moves forward and who has the power to move bills forward, and how even if you have the best idea in the world and you get widespread support across the caucus, if the leader does not want it to move forward, it will not move forward. Or if some other powerful person doesn't want it to move forward, it will not move forward. And so there are just all these challenges that have to do with just the process of legislating that I think are really important. But then there are institutional challenges that are built in that make it particularly difficult if you're coming in with an agenda that is about change, that is about reform, that is not about doing things the way they were done before. And so I try to pull open the curtains on that, and also think about strategy, right? Because every single one of these things has strategy involved, and we haven't gotten what we wanted, in part because we haven't understood yet how to move those levers of power in the right ways, or sometimes because we just don't have enough power. We just don't have enough people who are willing to stand up and fight for an issue, given whatever they see as the dynamics of that or the consequences of that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about this moment in history that we're in, which is pretty extraordinary. We have a, pandemic that I've never experienced in my lifetime, coupled with now this movement for racial justice and the Black Lives Matter movement that has, really taken hold the past month or so. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about those things through the theory of change that you write about, and some of the strategy that you were talking about as well. You talked about how not playing it small and the slow process of building momentum keeps going until you reach a tipping point. And do you think that we're at a tipping point right now for racial justice?
I think we are absolutely at a tipping point. It doesn't always tip, it doesn't always tip. And so you think you can be at a tipping point, and then you find out that there's other things in the way that are still blocking you. And so I think that this is an awakening across the country for too many people. And I say too many people because it shouldn't be. A lot of what we're facing right now around anti-Blackness, white supremacy, racism, Black people have been talking about this for a long time, fighting against this for a long time. And yet there are most people across the country who are just waking up because they saw the video of George Floyd, and or perhaps they saw the video of something else. And awakening is a good thing. It is a really good thing. But it also, it requires sustenance. And one of the things that has inspired me so much about the movement for Black Lives, and today we did a Congressional Progressive Caucus call with some of the leaders of the movement for Black Lives about the new legislation that they're working on from the ground up. And, one of the things I said is that work that the movement for Black Lives has built, led by, proud, queer Black women, has been so phenomenal, because it was not just a mobilization. It was organizing. It was sustained leadership development. It was decentralized leadership development. It was the development of policies that go towards a solution, not just saying this isn't working, but actually thinking about what is it that we want. And so the whole policy table that's developed within the movement for Black Lives that has come up with this Breathe Act is really pretty phenomenal. And you can't plan a moment like these protests. They were not planned. You couldn't plan them if you tried. However, you can build for a moment like this where something erupts and you're able to take advantage of that moment. I remember, our former organizing director at One America, David Ayala, who's passed on, and I tell his story in the book. But I remember that he used to say to me sometimes, we would have somebody that was about to get deported, something that would break, and somebody was about to be deported. And he would come in and he would say, this is the moment. We can we can do something with this. And when he first said it to me, I remember thinking, isn't that kind of callous? because it was almost like there was this energy there. But what he was saying is, we've been building for this moment. Now there's a crisis. And now we can utilize the strength that we've built to actually make some change forward. And that is the best way that you can honor the people, whether it's George Floyd or, you know, the woman who's about to be deported or has been deported. And so I think that all of this is to say that there's so much that is possible in this moment, and there's so much that is necessary. And there are still enormous barriers and challenges, and we're going to have to keep going. But there's no question that this moment, with I say the 4 pandemics, right? We've got COVID-19, we've got economic devastation, 44 million people who filed unemployment claims in just 3 months. We've got the emergence, sort of awakening of anti-Blackness and white supremacy, and the need to fight against that. And then we've got a crazy, xenophobic, racist, constitutional destroying president in the White House who's going to do everything he can to move this country backwards. And those 4 things are not actually disentangled. It shouldn't be a surprise that George Floyd had been laid off due to COVID. It shouldn't be a surprise that George Floyd got COVID, tested positive. And so I think that this moment is also this opportunity for us to connect all of these dots that people see as separate. They aren't separate. They are all related to each other in different ways. And Trump got elected, I say in the book, as he's a symptom and a cause. And he got elected because there were all these fault lines, deep fault lines that existed before: economic inequality, racism. I talk about the 3 supremacies in the book: corporate supremacy, individual supremacy, and white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And in many ways, that chapter was written last fall, but in many ways, I feel like it is the epitome of a lot of these pieces that we're seeing today.
And so, you know, you said the tipping point doesn't necessarily tip. So how do you tip?
Sorry, I know it's very, it's not, I know it's not what we want to hear, but you were going to ask me why. Because you have to actually, you know, I talk about the image of pushing boulders up mountains. I think of myself that way. Like, I feel like I'm always pushing a boulder up a mountain with these things that I'm working on. And we as immigrants, I think, often feel that way. But when you get to the top of the mountain, there is this moment where the boulder is sitting on top of the peak of the mountain, and it could go either back this way or it could go this way. And so you need some force to continue to push. You need that sustained level of protest. And we today, I think, for a lot of very understandable reasons and sometimes frustrating reasons, our attention spans are short. And we can have a rally that's really big, and maybe we can even have a rally for, you know, a set of rallies for a week, but can we have them for a month? Can we organize ourselves for a general strike? Can we actually put ourselves on the line in a different kind of a way than just signing a petition or even marching in the streets? And so that kind of power requires both organizing, leadership, and then kind of the dedication to see it through. You look at Sudan. I was talking to a group of Sudanese activists this morning because I've been working with the issue of Sudan, and went to Sudan and met a lot of the women who were involved in the peaceful nonviolent protests there. Brutal, nonviolent from their side, brutal from the Bashir's side. And you see how much they are willing to put on the line, how much detailed planning they do, and how much they themselves are ready to do what it takes to push that boulder over into democratic freedom and liberation. And we need to be able to do that as well.
So kind of following along that, what advice would you give to new organizers who might be protesting for the first time and doing this kind of mobilization for the first time, and want to make lasting change, but might not know some of those tools or some of those strategies that you're talking about? And what could you envision could be some of the political change that could come from this movement on the street?
Well, that's what's so exciting to me, is that there are a lot of people who are engaging who I don't think had been engaging before. And there's a lot of dedication to learning and education. And so I think that that is really great. I mean, people reading about the history, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had about the history of law enforcement. You know, why was law enforcement actually set up, and what was it structured to do? And it was to brutalize, you know, the slaves who were seeking freedom. It was to implement Jim Crow laws, and people have not thought about that. And so I think all of us have so much to learn about the history. And so that in and of itself is really, really important, because we have a lot of assumptions about why things are the way they are, and often we're wrong. And so finding and seeking out that history is critical. I think we need more deep training and education in nonviolent, in actual nonviolent civil disobedience. I've been to the South on a pilgrimage with John Lewis, Representative John Lewis, to Selma and Montgomery and other places. And I've been in church basements where I've gotten to get the wisdom of how deeply the civil rights movement actually planned for everything they did. And I'm struck often by how little of that we do. We have a lot of meetings, and you know, we spend a lot of time, but we haven't actually trained ourselves to be ready to build the internal discipline that taking on some of these big things would require. And so I think that for young organizers, or for people who are newer to this, I would say, you know, study what happened, but also train yourself in pushing the boundaries of what you think you're comfortable doing. So if you're comfortable, we used to call it leadership ladders at One America. You know, how do you move people through a leadership ladder? You can sign a petition, that's probably at the bottom of the leadership ladder. You've taken action, but it's easy. You're not really putting yourself out. Maybe you can go work on a campaign that requires a little bit more time. Maybe you know, get involved in a civil disobedience protest that involves even more. And so how do you think about training yourself and moving higher and higher in your commitment to make a difference? And how do you, if you're white, if you're privileged, how do you recognize that privilege and always remember that you need to center the voices of those who have wisdom from within themselves because of who they are and what they face every day? And I think that you know, those are some of the lessons, but the other one is it's not easy. And don't think you're going to do it just for a day and then you're going to go back and, you know, go back to your old life. There was nothing normal about 60% of Americans having $400 in their bank account. There was nothing normal about, you know, having 87 million Americans without access to health insurance or underinsured. There was nothing normal about all of the deaths that had happened that were not caught on videotape, that involved putting a knee on somebody's neck. Those were all happening before we saw what was happening. And so that can't be where we go back to. We've got to go forward.
Yeah. The last question before I'm going to move to the audience questions was the point you made about broadening coalitions and resisting the temptation to kind of fall into this expectation that you're going to have 100% agreement with allies and alignment with allies. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that's important in both organizing and legislation?
Yeah, I have a great story in the book about when I was out knocking on doors for my state Senate campaign, and I was knocking on Republican doors because there were only 2 Democrats running, and I figured somebody needed to talk to the Republicans. And I went and knocked on the door of this guy who was, you know, cleaning his Harleys, and it was like big and burly and had a lot of tattoos and was listed as a Republican. And, you know, I had my own stereotypes about what he was going to be like, but I'm willing to talk to anybody. So I go up to talk to him, and we're just agreeing on everything. He agrees with me on the $15 minimum wage. He agrees with me on, you know, the need to form a union, whatever, these different things. And then he says, okay, well, what do you think about guns? And I said, well, I thought, uh-oh. I said, I don't like them. I said, to be honest, I'm scared of them. And, and then I said, but, I understand that people have the right to own a gun. However, I don't think that you should be able to do that without having proper safety mechanisms in place. It's just like we wouldn't allow anyone to drive a car. There should be requirements for people who own a gun. And I also said, my husband, owned guns and hunted. I didn't tell him that my husband is a Buddhist now and vegetarian, doesn't have any guns anymore, but it felt like a good entry point, to say, hey, I know some people who have guns. And he looked at me and he said, oh, you're one of those Democrats. You just want to take my guns away. And we started to talk about it, and it became clear we weren't going to agree, and I needed to move on to the next door. And I said, well, I need to move on, but can I have your vote? And he looks at me and he goes, I was going to vote for you, but I can't because I don't agree with you because you're going to try to take my guns away. And I said, yeah, I understand. His wife was standing there. And I said, how long have you and your wife been married? And he said, 20 years. And I said, oh, okay. And do you and your wife agree on 100% of issues? And he starts laughing, guffawing. And he goes, of course not. And I said, well, you married her. I'm just asking for your vote. And he just cracked up and shook my hand and said, you know what I like about you? You're willing to tell me the truth. You're willing to say what you think. And we don't have to agree on everything. You're right. He said, but if you try to take my guns away, I'm going to be on your ass. And I said, that's fair, okay. But I think it's a really important lesson for us. And two things. One, that we don't have to agree on 100% of issues. We don't even agree with people that are closest to us on 100% of issues. And we shouldn't write somebody off because they don't agree with us on one issue, or even on two. And then the other is, we progressives, we want people to agree with us not only on the end point of what we're trying to get to, we want them to agree with us on steps 1 to 10 of how we got there. You have to have the same morals as me to believe that immigration reform is necessary. You can't just believe immigration reform is necessary if you won't also say to me that it is a moral right, that we are, that undocumented immigrants are just the same as you and me, whatever the things are. We tend to want people to think the same way as us, not just to agree with us at the end. And I think that really stops us from a lot of progress. We should just accept that people might get to the same conclusion in a different way. And they may not share the same reasons for it, but if the goal is to move the ball forward, then let's go to that place and let's welcome people in, and accept that maybe we can build a deeper shared understanding if we start from that one place.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to move over to our audience questions. If you have additional questions, please add them in. The first one is from Willis, who's wondering what your relationship is with the new women of color members of Congress, and if your ideas are aligned with theirs, and if you're hopeful about the future of our country's leadership having these women as your peers.
Oh, I love them. We do a lot of things together. All of the members of the squad are in the Progressive Caucus. We invited Ilhan Omar to be the Progressive Caucus whip. I was the first member of Congress to endorse both Ilhan and Rashida. I had worked with Rashida for 20 years before, and Ilhan I had gotten to know because when I got elected to Congress, she had just been elected to the state Senate or state legislature in Minnesota. And so we got to know each other kind of on the campaign trail. I've gotten to know Alexandria and Ayanna through their time in Congress, and it's been just a delight to spend time with them, to listen to their ideas, to find ways to move their priorities forward. A lot of people don't know that it's because of the Progressive Caucus negotiations around Nancy Pelosi, which I go into this in the book, but around Nancy Pelosi becoming speaker, that we were able to argue for progressive freshman members to be placed on what's called an A committee. These are some of the bizarre, arcane things about Congress. The money committees you can't be on as a new member. That was true when I came in. And I thought that was ridiculous. And so we fought very hard to get Ayanna, Alexandria, Katie Porter, and Rashida are all on financial services. And so when you see Katie Porter questioning somebody or AOC questioning somebody, just know it's because we actually strategized to get them onto those committees. And it's because we knew they would bring so much to the table. So yes, I feel totally hopeful about, you know, having them. And there are a number of members who came in this last cycle, and there are a number of members that we're fighting for today. We have a CPC PAC, a Progressive Caucus PAC. We put a lot of work into our first independent expenditure campaign, which was for Mondaire Jones in New York, who won. We think we're going to be welcoming Jamal Bowman in, which is fantastic. We're working hard for Kara Eastman in Nebraska. And so we have, you know, just a tremendous opportunity to elect progressives and to help them know exactly how to deal with Congress. We started an orientation last year for new members of Congress for the Progressive Caucus, because I never had that. I was like, where's my orientation? Who's my mentor? Who's going to tell me what to do? I didn't have any of that. And so I really wanted to have that in place. And so we had that for Ayanna and Ilhan and Rashida and many others that came in with them.
Thank you. There's several questions about CHOP. So I'll go with the one from Michelle. As an activist organizer, what are your thoughts on CHOP? Where do you think they've been most effective, and what do you wish they could have done differently?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think that everything that happened in a way happened in part because the city's response to the protests at the very beginning was so flawed. And I called that out very early in saying we shouldn't have had curfews, we shouldn't have had the National Guard in, we shouldn't have been having police in riot gear, you know, with tear gas and rubber bullets and pepper spray and flashbangs. I called for a stop to all of that within 2 days of it happening. And I was really kind of stunned as a place that saw the WTO and saw the lessons from the WTO, why we would respond that way when it was exactly that behavior that protesters were protesting. And so I think that everything that happened after that was in part tied to that. And I think where CHOP has been effective has been to, really, at least in some of the things I saw, center some of the Black voices. That has been somewhat uneven from what I can see. Sometimes it seems to be the case and sometimes not so much. But to really think about what are the ways in which we can use this to put the demands of the movement forward, not to create a new set of things, but to actually use it it came out of the movement for, against white supremacy and for justice for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the many other people. Sometimes it felt like it was moving around in terms of what it was trying to accomplish relative to those goals. However, peaceful protest and organizing and dissent are absolutely essential. And sometimes you need time for these things to be able to develop. I think that we still don't know all of the things that happened that led to the Seattle Police Department vacating the East Precinct. I don't know why they did that, frankly. I have talked to the FBI about it. I don't think that there was a direct, credible threat on the East Precinct from what I've heard. And so I think that created all kinds of problems because we don't want people, we don't want violence to occur and not to be able to have, not to be able to bring people to justice because the crime scene is tampered with or those kinds of things. But there are too many things that have been conflated together. And I think at the end of the day, what the protesters are doing and what people are trying to ask for with CHOP is a set of demands that are important, that have to do with actually bringing about justice and community safety for everyone. And listen, you and I lived in the south end of the city. We had shootings in the south end all the time, and frankly, there weren't a lot of people responding to those shootings. So I think that violence everywhere in the city should be paid attention to, not just in that zone. And I think that sometimes things get paid attention to because of where they happen, and so I think it's complicated in that sense.
Yeah, I just posted about that today, that exact point, that I don't see a lot of attention and concern about the nearly, weekly shootings in my neighborhood. This is an interesting question. Considering the dysfunction at the federal level, to make progressive change on issues like climate change, should we develop progressive federalism and alliance with more states?
Well, I think that, I talk about the $15 minimum wage, sanctuary city ordinances, like so many things start at the local level. And I kind of think about it as it's not an either or. You sort of need to have them going in both ways, because otherwise what you end up with is a state like Washington, where thanks to the work that, many of the people that are listening tonight probably were a part of creating around immigrant rights, around a $15 minimum wage, around gun responsibility, we have had the kind of state government that has allowed us to do that, and the kind of political power that has allowed us to do that. But what about the states in the South? What about the states that continue to have $3.15 minimum wage and tipped wages? What about Florida and Texas, where the unemployment systems have been tightened and tightened and tightened, so people can't get any relief there? And so you have this really disparate effect if you don't have certain federal standards. However, to get those federal standards, just imagine this. We were fighting for a $15 minimum wage in Seattle, first major city in the country to pass that. I was proud to be on the committee that helped get there. And now it was so controversial. Then I went to the state Senate, and my first day in the state Senate, I was putting forward what we had decided at the time was going to be a $12.50 bill, or $12 bill, I think, minimum wage bill. And nobody wanted to take it. Business didn't want to take it. And they were like, no, that's crazy. That's too much. And I said, believe me, it's going to be more if we go to the people and go to the ballot, which is what we did. We got $13.50 statewide. Now, here in Congress, in this session with Democrats controlling the House, we passed a $15 minimum wage bill with almost unanimous support across the Democratic caucus. So this is the way that it has to happen, because if we are to ensure that you don't just have to live in Washington State to get a $15 minimum wage, and frankly, in Washington State, you need a lot more than $15 minimum wage now. But we've got to have some equity for people who are living in other states where you don't have the same ability. So you've got to really have both, and one can help move the other back and forth.
Thank you. Question from David. What do you think it would take to get reparations for descendants of American slavery?
Well, I think the fact that the conversation is mainstream now is remarkable. The fact that it's come, that it came up on the presidential trail. And again, I credit a lot of this to the Movement for Black Lives, to, a number of groups that have been working for racial justice for years. And I will give a lot of credit to several of the Black members of Congress who have really been pushing for this. My friend Barbara Lee, who's one of the great ones in my mind in terms of her track record on really fighting and standing up for what's right. That's how I started thinking about people in elected office perhaps not being, all bad, was when Barbara Lee took her positions on the Iraq War. So she's been working on this for a long time. She's gone to South Africa. She's really done a lot of the research, worked with Nelson Mandela when he was alive and others to think about what is the process that we go through. There's nothing to reconcile here. This is about truth telling, but it is not about the reconciliation part is very, very different than what was in South Africa. And so she's really thought through this, and she's introduced a bill around the truth-telling piece. Sheila Jackson Lee has introduced a reparations bill, a study for exactly what that could look like. And I think that is, I think we're gonna hear those bills maybe in July in the Judiciary Committee. Hopefully we're gonna have hearings on them and be marked up and be able to move forward. I think we're probably not at the place where we have enough momentum built to pass it, and certainly not with Trump as president and Republicans in the Senate. But the fact is that it is on people's lips and people are thinking about it. And this moment in our history may actually open up a real conversation that is absolutely necessary in my mind. I'm a signatory to all those bills because I think that's what I believe in reparations. And I believe that we need both the truth telling, but we also need we need people to be made whole in different ways.
There's a question from Thomas, who says a lot of nice things about you, and also wants to know if you would consider running for U.S. Senator.
Well, I talk about this in the book. I'm very bad at planning my next move. I really don't think about what I'm going to do next. I think about what I'm doing now, and I think about how I can do it better and more effectively. And then I try to keep my eyes open. If some opportunity comes up that seems like the right thing, great. But I'm totally focused on, we just have a lot to do right now. And so thank you, Thomas. Not that, we'll see what the future brings, but I'm not a planner. I'm a great wanderer. I try to keep myself open to whatever's next.
This is another quick question. Someone who, I don't see the name, wants to know if you're recording an audiobook version and appreciated your reading.
Yes, I am recording an audiobook version. Because of COVID, it got delayed. So I believe that it is being scheduled in various days. I think they told me I need to have 12 days to record it. And so it's going to hopefully be happening over July and part of August. So it's a little bit delayed, but it will be there. They gave me the option to have somebody else read it. And Naomi, I didn't want somebody else to read my words. I wanted to read my own words. And so it's going to take a lot of time, but I wanted people to hear my voice in it. And this book took me 8 years to actually get finished. So I figure I should read my own words.
And the last question before we start wrapping up is from Tiffany, who is a solo mama of color who organizes around issues of caregiving. And she's kicked around the idea of running for office and local office. And she wanted to know if there's any advice that you have for moms of color who are coming up against the double barriers of running for political office.
Yeah, I talk about that actually in the book. I talk about all the barriers, because when you run for lower office, it's hard to run for higher office right away. It's not impossible. I mean, you look at AOC or some of those other folks, but it's hard. And so when you look at lower office, it's very difficult because it often is not paid or it's part-time, and it's just not suitable for moms, folks of color, moms with small kids, single moms. I mean, all of those things. And so there are some tips in there for how to deal with that. And but really, I think it is part of the challenge. I've been working to try to get people in the philanthropic community who care about getting more folks of color and more diversity and more women, more single moms into office, and to say, you really need to establish a fund so that people can get paid and get childcare. By the way, we should just provide childcare. That would be a big bonus here in this country, and we're working on that. But I think that there are a lot of things that you have to deal with in your personal life that you don't have support for if you want to run for office. And so those are a little bit harder because they're more systemic problems. I do have a lot of tips just in terms of inspiring you to know that you can do it. I'll cite Katie Porter, who is a single mom with 4 kids and lives in California. And every day, every time I see her, I sort of like bow down to her, because I don't know how she does it, but she does it. And so we have more and more models of people who are doing it and could give you, some direct tips about what that means and what sacrifices you have. I don't believe you can have it all. I believe you can have different things at different times, and in the end you can satisfy all the pieces of what you need in your life. But there are times when you make choices to do one thing or another, recognizing that that's not everything you need, but it's what you have to do for that moment.
There's a comment in the question that says Katie Porter rocks. This was before you even said that. So
she totally does. She's really wonderful. She's a very good friend, and we've done a lot of really fun stuff together.
I always end all my interviews with folks asking if there's anything that I didn't ask about or we didn't talk about that you want to talk about or relate.
I think maybe the one thing to say is just on the book itself. One of the things that has been
Hi everyone, this is Josh from Town Hall. Looks like we've just lost Pramila for a second, so we're gonna see if we can get her back, but yeah, just give us 1 second. Sorry about that.
I'm back.
Yay!
That was very dramatic. We can't let it end like that.
Somebody wrote cliffhanger in the comment.
That's right. You got to buy the next book. It'll take another 8 years to write. No, I just wanted to say that, one of the things that has been, I'm a writer and a lover of writing and the creative arts, and I really miss that part. I miss going to Elliott Bay for my book readings that I used to do all the time. I never get a chance to do that anymore. And so I just wanted to say that the process of writing this has been amazing, really challenging to find the time. But the process of remembering these stories and finding the arc of the story and celebrating, some, I couldn't do everybody, but celebrating some of the many people that were involved was a really wonderful thing. And what I'm hoping for out of this book is that everybody, not just brown women of color, brown women, or women of color more broadly, or women more broadly, but that everybody who's really interested in justice and in change finds something in here that gives you hope, that gives you optimism, and that moves you to action, because this is all about the fact that we have the power to make the change that we want in the world. And I firmly, firmly believe that. And I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight. There are so many things happening around the city. And I want to thank you for also being a part of my story by electing me to represent you in the 7th District. It has really been an incredible privilege, and I will continue to learn and think about how we do this better. But I couldn't ask for a more supportive district to be able to test this theory of change and to continue this work. And Naomi, thank you so much. I think not everybody knows that you had your own part to play in One America, and the beautiful branding that is One America today had your beautiful hands all over it as you did that work. And so I'm grateful to you for having this conversation with me tonight. Thank you for leading it so beautifully, along with everything else you do.
Thank you so much. This has been great. I'm going to hand it back over to Town Hall for a few closing comments, and thank you everyone and your questions. Town Hall? There you are.
Hi. Well, Congresswoman Jayapal, Naomi, thank you both so much for tonight. It's been a really hopeful conversation, very enjoyable to listen to, and yeah, gives me a lot of hope. Thank you both so much for your leadership. And thank you everyone for watching. If you are interested in following more Town Hall content, you can follow our Crowdcast channel here by clicking the follow button in the top right corner. If you're interested in purchasing Congresswoman Jayapal's book, please use the button or the link in your feed to purchase from Elliott Bay and support them. As Ware mentioned early on, we are going on a bit of a hiatus for the month of July, but we do have one more event coming up tomorrow night. We're going to be live back in the building with our Life on the Margins residency podcast. So join us for that tomorrow evening at 7, and we'll see you there. And thank you both so much again for this great event.
Thanks, everybody. Good night. Good night, Mom, or good morning, Mom.
Thank you.